we're going to be ranking all of the ranged DPS in Mythic Plus based on their meta. And it is probably one of the most controversial ranking of the DPS because it does include augmentation. I do want to preface this and kind of make the disclaimer that, listen, if we're going to be charitable enough and look at the overall performance of all the specs, considering that all of them are doing 27s and higher as of recording this video, then we're probably looking at something like this ranking, which you can see on the screen right now. This is a more balanced look at the specs, and you can see a lot of specs are into S tier, a lot of specs are into A tier actually, because they are clearing close, if not already getting and dipping into plus 30s. All the specs in A tier. Marksmanship and Affliction are a little bit behind everybody else, but this is the reality of the meta. Specs are actually fairly balanced. There's a bigger gap between the best specs, let's say Fire Mage, Augmentation, and Affliction, which is still real, but Affliction is still clearing keys very, very high. And that's not that bad, because the fantasy of Affliction is just fun and you should play it. You do a lot of damage, you spread all the corruptions around, and it has a nice fantasy, okay? And no fantasy would be complete without today's sponsor, Final Fantasy XIV Online. You no doubt have heard about it by now, as it is an amazing MMORPG with an incredible richness to find in the world of Eorzea. With 20 different jobs or classes for those of you who haven't played yet, the game will give you a really cool variety in terms of content to access. Not only that, but the free trial includes 16 of those jobs, the entirety of the base game content to play, that being A Realm Reborn, and also the first two expansions, Heaven's Sword and Stormblood, all the way up to level 70 with unlimited game time for free. And now is the perfect time to start, because just after the Japan Fan Fest, we know that Dawn Trail, the next expansion, will launch this summer with a lot of cool new features to explore. It brings 2 new jobs on top of the existing 20, the melee DPS Viper and the just announced Pictomancer, which looks like the perfect way to color your gameplay in 2024 and explore the regions of Yogg-Toroil and Zac-Toroil. Click the link in the description to start your own adventure and support the channel while you're at it. Thank you Final Fantasy XIV Online for sponsoring this video. But let's not delay it too long and actually place Affliction where it belongs. F tier. Listen, I'm not putting into F tier because it's a dog spec, because you cannot get into groups, you cannot get into groups, or that it cannot be played. It can definitely be played and it does a lot of damage, but it is the worst of the bunch and it does need a lot of help to kind of catch up to the top tier specs. It's still doing really good damage. If you're just looking at the top 10 Affliction Warlocks in the world, they're doing pretty high keys. Not as high as Augmentation, however, which is unsurprisingly S tier, because of course it is. Where else would Augmentation be except S tier? It is actually doing really well. It seems to kind of trail off. If you really look at its journey across the seasons so far, you can see that it kind of dips a little bit in terms of its overall position within the meta. It's still S tier, but it's looking like by the end of the season, we might not even see Augmentation in S tier or in the top keys cleared. Maybe in the Fated season, who knows. You are seeing, however, Balanced Druid right now into S tier. This spec kind of juggled between S and A quite a bit, and now it's steadily into S tier. It is part of the comp that's pushing the highest keys as of recording this. If you look at the top 20, I believe, Radar IO keys cleared as of today, you're definitely going to be seeing Balanced Druid there as Augmentation and Mage spec. That Mage spec is not Arcane though. Listen, Arcane actually does a lot of damage, and if I'm not mistaken, maybe it's probably the best DPS spec in the raid. Obviously, we're talking about Mythic Plus, not the raid, but the fact that it can perform that well in raid does actually imply that it's pretty good in dungeons as well. Now, you can also look at the top Arcane Mage, which is actually pushing really hard, but there is quite a gap between that person and the rest of the Arcane Mages that are actually pushing keys, because if everybody would be close to that, we would probably be seeing Arcane into A tier or something similar, where let's say Beast Mastery Hunter will go, because Beast Mastery Hunter is cranking, man, and A tier as a whole will be the tier that, you know, you can kind of replace S tier specs with them because they're actually really good. You are actually seeing BM Hunter pushing some of the highest keys in the teams that, you know, have that Augmentation and that Mage or that Balanced Druid. They're actually really good. The only reason they're not S tier is because BM Hunter, I think it's in the top 16th highest key cleared, and you keep seeing it more and more after that, which is not too shabby. I mean, think about it. This spec has only 15 other dungeons cleared better than the dungeon that it was a part of. So it is really, really good. And in a similar situation, we have Demonology, where I think it's 18th in the world right now, the top Demonology player, which is still really good. And when I say 18th, I mean if you look at the top 20 keys cleared in Radar.io, it's all the way down here on the 18th or 19th spot rather. Depending on when you watch this, the ranks will probably change a little bit, but it doesn't change the fact that Demonology can actually push and duke it out with the best of the best. It's probably not going to create the most efficient comps to push 32s. I think we already have a 32 done, and we're probably going to see more and more as we're getting to the later stages of the season. Destruction Warlock, however, is a little bit lower. I'm generously going to put it into B tier. There's quite a difference between Destruction and Arcane, but they are clearing keys at a similar level. So I am going to put it into B tier because C tier is reserved for a special candidate. Destruction Warlock has seen its ups and downs. I think this is as high as it climbed this season, at least in all rankings, the way we look at the meta and the overall, let's say, IO, keys cleared, logs, all of that stuff. It's not bad. It's not Demonology. It's definitely not Balanced Druid or Augmentation, but it's doing its job. It's Destruction. Simple, efficient, you can get your stuff done. That mage spec that I talked about is actually Fire Mage, and boy did Fire Mage have a trip throughout this season. It is, statistically speaking, on all fronts and all accounts, the best DPS spec in Mythic Plus. Once again, it's been a journey, but it's back, baby, and it's smoking or burning everything around, which is kind of nice to see. It's nice to see Fire Mage. I would love to see other specs as well, not just Mage, but listen, Fire Mage has it going for it. It's been a long time. It's been through some iterations, through some horrible designs in terms of its overall playstyle, Pyroclasm, but it is kind of fun still to play, and it's nice to see that people are pushing keys higher and higher, most likely augmented by augmentation, but not PI anymore, as I think it was in Season 1. Frost Mage is also decent. It's going to be into B tier alongside its Arcane brother. It's a little bit lower in terms of the overall keys, but not too low, and it's nice to see the Mage specs kind of, duking it out and kind of clearing similar content overall. Frost has seen a steadily increase in its overall performance, both in raids and dungeons. Obviously, it's not, S tier, but it is really good, and all hail Glacial Spike. Marksmanship is the said spec that the C tier has been reserved for. It's not as bad as Affliction. It does fall behind, and it's quite leagues behind Beast Mastery Hunter, which is why it's getting there. It has seen a rise ever since it's got its tier set. At the beginning of the season, if you look at its overall performance, it kind of started really low, and now it's a little bit average, middle of the pack. It probably can get into B tier at the very least. I'm not seeing the keys cleared as high as B tier. Maybe one or two people that are pushing marksmanship to their utmost performance can duke it out with the likes of Warlocks and Frost Mages and Arcane Mages, but the grand scheme of things, the marksmanship players are not seeing it that high of a rise. Similarly, Devastation also goes into C tier. It's slightly better than marksmanship in terms of what it can clear. It might as well be B tier, but I feel like there's a little bit of a dip in terms of there's some Devastation players that are really good. You can always see it in the top 10 keys cleared, and the rest kind of lagging a little behind. Now, whether or not those top Devastations, and same goes for other specs, are getting carried by their team in those high keys, you can say that about anything these days, to be honest. And if we look at it that way, we're never going to be able to rank or look at the meta in any way, shape, or form. We're just going to see, listen, was it in a key that was successful? It was. So it goes there, and that's it. Elemental is also very decent. It's also going to be B tier, although with melee spec enhancement is actually outshining Elemental, which is probably why we're seeing a difference between Elemental and enhancement, why it's B tier, because it is doing a lot of damage. It has some surprisingly good single target as well, mind you, and it's really fun to play. That aside, it is still a shaman spec. It is still kind of squishy, which is definitely going to hold it back. You can say the same about enhancement, which is likely higher in overall rankings, but enhancement does pack a bigger punch and has more high uptime on high octane damage, and that's where Elemental goes. Shadow Priest is leading the front of B tier. I cannot realistically put it into A tier because you don't really see Shadow Priest clearing the top keys anymore. However, it's by no means doing really poorly. Obviously, it brings a lot of utility. It dispels power infusion, of course, and it has some killer execute damage and some killer damage, period. It doesn't seem to be able to hold it just quite yet in the same leagues as BM Hunter and Demonology Warlock. And this is kind of how the meta looks like as of this moment. It's been really fun to kind of look at how things are. Thank you once again, Final Fantasy XIV Online, for sponsoring this video. And if you want to just have a little bit more fun and not worry too much about the overall rankings and performance, you can check our video on the most fun range DPS specs to play and take your pick from there and maybe pick up an alt and have some fun. Just check it out.